if you just mix these things together and start letting your bread rise, it's not going to be very tasty. It's going to be edible but somewhat bland. And what gives French bread's flavor is essentially from how the dough is treated before you start. So essentially letting the dough ferment a little bit is what gives a good French bread that kind of subtle nutty aroma. And a way a lot of breads are made, they're either made with sourdoughs or pre-ferment. A sourdough is basically the dough is allowed to ferment with both yeast, and it also develops a symbiotic sort of infection with local bacteria. And the bacteria that are living symbiotically with the yeast will break down the sugars and the carbohydrates in the bread and make things like lactic acid. The yeast will also make alcohols, and this is what these other chemicals are basically the subtle flavors that a good bread has. To do this, you have to basically you'll have something called a pre-ferment. A professional bread baking establishment will do something like they'll have a starter culture, which for sourdoughs, they essentially keep feeding this little this culture of dough with flour and water every day. They take a little bit from it, and then they add their fresh yeast and their fresh flour, they mix it up, they let it rise, and then this is how they'll get their sourdough. They can do the same thing with French bread. So they'll use a little bit of the dough from the day before and mix it in with their fresh ingredients and start making a new loaf that way. So some things that you can't really do at home, most people don't have a professional baker's oven, which uses steam, high temperature steam. You know, we can kind of approximate that by putting pans of water in your conventional oven. You can spray the bread a little bit with a sprayer, like what I have right here. This is just a heavy-duty sprayer that I use for this purpose. And you can get some of the effects of steam on a cooking loaf of bread. The steam essentially hydrolyzes the carbohydrates on the surface of the bread, and you get basically disaccharides and polysaccharides, and that's what kind of gives the bread loaf like a crackly kind of texture on the surface. I don't know if any of you have seen this when breads come out of an oven from a professional bakery. Usually most people who bake at home you can't really get this effect. You may not have noticed it, but you have to have steam to get that effect. Something else to consider with baking in a conventional oven at home, if you try to just take your loaf of bread and cook on a metal sheet, the metal sheet doesn't really have much of a heat capacity. So when you take your loaf, which is at 75 degrees Fahrenheit, and you put it onto the sheet's actually going to cool down. The bottom of the loaf won't get very hot. The top of the loaf, which is exposed to the 450 to 475 degree Fahrenheit temperature, will start cooking a lot faster than the underside. So you'll get a loaf that's kind of white on the bottom and brown on the top. The baking stone, which is in the oven right now, it's been preheating for like an hour and a half. That baking stone it's got a large thermal mass, and you put the loaf of bread on it, it's going to stay at about 460 degrees Fahrenheit, and the loaf of bread will come out nice and evenly cooked. This will make a real difference when you're baking at home. You can buy pizza stones. They don't really cost very much. They're like, it's like a ceramic piece about this big or so. And I recommend using something like that You can also just use a piece of bluestone or slate that you find outside and just clean. It doesn't need to be a piece of stone. Some people have described a method where they cook inside one of these ceramic Dutch ovens. It's just a big, heavy-duty ceramic pot with a lid. You can put the bread in that. That's got enough of a thermal mass. You put the bread in there, and the underside of the bread will cook along with the top. You'll get good, even heating and a nicely cooked loaf that way. Those Dutch ovens also will trap in the moisture, so they do a good job. They're kind of expensive though. They can be around $100, especially one that's big enough to actually cook a loaf. So I have a breadstone that's pretty close to the inner dimension of the oven, so I can use almost all of the real estate when I'm cooking breads, and I can cook 2 loaves at once. If I try to get maybe 3 loaves on there at a time, the loaves will get too close to each other and they won't cook evenly. So they have to have a little bit of space. A convection oven, which is a slightly more expensive oven that people can get in their home, has a fan, and that circulates the hot air. They do a better job of evenly cooking the bread. But I have a fairly modern non-convection oven at home, and it does fine. Before that, I had an oven from the 60s that was horrible. It actually set breads on fire. So you have to, some ovens are so bad, doesn't matter what you do with your bread, you're going to get uneven cooking, and you just need a different oven. So the other issue of a rising chamber. I fashioned a relatively primitive rising chamber here. In the summertime, it's not usually too hard to find a spot in the house that's at 70 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. But in the wintertime, it actually might be a little challenging to find some place that's consistently in the mid-70s, actually, maybe up to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. So all I did was take 2 plastic bins that fit in each other and put some water in the void between them. And there's a low wattage fish tank heater. There's a little fish tank heater in there. Now, the fish tank heater only has to, change the temperature of a few gallons of water by a few degrees Fahrenheit, and maybe 10 degrees Fahrenheit if your house is a little cold in the wintertime. So it doesn't need to be a particularly powerful fish tank heater. You don't need to spend $100 on it, something relatively inexpensive. But the fish tank heaters have settings that are good for baking bread, because fish, want to be somewhere between low 80s and 70 degrees most of the time. So this is a basic rising chamber. I use it for the pre-ferment phase and for the final rising phases of the bread.
And so I think it might be worth just explaining, it's the heaters and the water in the lower chamber,
yes,
and that is the water's touching the next chamber, which is using the heat or radiating heat.
This whole space in between is filled with water. The bread itself isn't anywhere near the water, and the fish tank heater is obviously in the water. The fish tank heater is not lying in the chamber. If the fish tank heater is outside of water, it will burn up. So the fish tank heater has to be in the water. And I've got a thermometer in there to kind of just keep track of the temperature, but usually the fish tank heater settings are pretty close to what they should be. So this, and you can use this too for other things, like obviously you can still use the bins if you need them for something else, but you can use this to germinate seedlings if you like to garden. Because if you've ever you start your seedlings in the spring and the house isn't very warm, you put your seedlings in here and you turn it up to 80 degrees and everything will germinate within a week. So you can. This is a nifty way of doing multiple things.
Is there anything special about the inside of this?
No, there's nothing special about the inside.
Or the way the bread is placed or anything like that?
No, but I have this cloth on top, and what you don't want is when your dough is rising, you don't want a crust form on the outside of the dough. So if I just had it, if the room was say at 76 degrees and you put the loaf on the table and you're like, well, it's 76 degrees, that's the right temperature, but it would obviously dry out a little bit on the surface of the dough, and that would keep it from expanding, and the dough won't rise as much. So to keep it somewhat moist and from drying out, you cover it with cloth and perhaps some plastic over that if you want. The rising chamber itself, since it's somewhat enclosed, there isn't much drying going on. The cloth in this case, I use a natural linen, which seems to work better than cotton. Sometimes a cotton cloth, when placed on the dough, will stick, or a saran wrap, often placed directly on the dough, will stick. And when you go to move these loaves that you just formed around, if you go to peel off the plastic and it sticks, you'll destroy the loaf. So it's, especially during the final rise, the shape of the dough is fragile, and the way you handle it will definitely affect the final appearance of the loaf and how fluffy it is when it gets into the oven. Okay, so one other point to bring out is the bread rising basket. So this is a bread form, and they're made so that the dough usually doesn't stick too much to these, and they work better than, say, something like a ceramic bowl. If you just put your bread into a ceramic bowl, this is a French bread, so there's no fat to sort of to keep it from sticking anywhere. It would very likely stick to the edge of the bowl when you transfer it from here into the oven. And if that happens, the loaf is going to get torn up and it won't look very good. So that's the reason why I use rising baskets. And there's a number of different sort of rising baskets or bread forms out there. There's the commercial ones that the bakeries use, which are usually silicone pads over a stainless form or something like that, especially for baguettes. They just sort of have like these troughs that they put the bread in. All of these things are, unfortunately, they're a little pricey. The rising baskets can be a little pricey, but you might be able to find something that doesn't cost very much to help you to help your breads keep their shape and to make it easy when you go to transfer them onto the baking stone. So when you go to transfer onto the baking stone, you want to put down a generous layer of coarse cornmeal, and this will help keep the bread from sticking to the stone. Usually, and you just cook directly on the stone. Obviously, not too many bacteria can survive the temperatures of the oven, so you don't have to worry about that. Just clean the stone off with a brush or something when it's cooled when you're done. Okay, so obviously the whole process of making bread, it takes a lot of time. The pre-ferment, I started it last night, so I took some of the ingredients here. It's called the poolish here in the ingredient list. Just a little bit of yeast, and the idea is to let it grow, and then the yeast start to starve, and then they start to ferment and die. And that's what gives the bread that sort of nutty aroma, mild nutty aroma. Unfortunately, my poolish didn't really start out fast enough last night, so I don't think that this is going to be a particularly good example of an aromatic bread. It's not going to have a very strong aroma, this bread. Because I wanted to sort of time this so that the bread would be going in the oven right about now, I couldn't really, I couldn't let the poolish develop for another, say, 8 hours or something like that. But if you're baking bread, when you're letting the poolish grow or the pre-ferment, you should basically watch it slowly puff up over hours, watch the carbon dioxide being produced from the yeast acting on the flour, and then it's going to start to slow down and start to cave in on itself. So this will happen over the course of hours, and that's when that's when it's becoming fermented, when it's basically the yeast activity is starting to reduce because they don't have any sugar left to consume in the dough. Okay, so I use a mixer to help out. I mean, this definitely saves you some time and some effort because you can have this mixing and then you can go off and do other things with your hands. You obviously don't need a mixer. You're just going to have to put in the time with and your physical energy of mixing and kneading dough. A couple of basic points about mixing. The pre-ferment, I take it and I add it to the final dough components, the fresh yeast, some new flour, and salt. I incorporate it here in the mixer, and then I let it sit before I add the salt. I let the dough sit for maybe 10 to 20 minutes, covered with some plastic. That gives the water a chance to fully hydrate the proteins, the carbohydrates, and the flour. And if you don't wait that, you'll get a different sort of texture, a rougher texture to the bread. So it's important that after you get all your ingredients together, it's just a first to mix things, let it sit for a bit, then add the salt, and then start mixing. I tend to add the salt after this point because the salt is also partly dehydrating. So I tend to add that right before I start kneading the dough to develop the gluten in the bread. Okay, so other things like the flour, I just use King Arthur bread flour. There's other bread flours, there are unbleached bread flours that you can get at the supermarket. This one seems to work fine. I also sometimes, I've been experimenting a little bit lately with a 00 flour, which is a super fine flour. This is the flour that's used a little more often in Italian breads and in pizza dough. It's got a very subtle difference in texture and flavor, but maybe you'll recognize it when you try some bread today. Okay, so I've got like a little timeline at the bottom of the instruction sheet, and it shows the pre-ferment or the poolish finishing after 14 hours or so, and then there's about 6 hours between mixing, letting the bread rise, folding it. The reason why you fold the bread in between some rises is to get the texture even and to get the temperature somewhat uniform throughout the loaf. If you don't fold in between rising periods, you might develop a bit of a crust on the surface of the bread and it won't rise quite as well. I'm not great at shaping loaves. This is something that professional bakers who spend a lot of time shaping loaves. It's not just about making the shape, but they're also they're trying to even out the texture of the loaf and even out the temperature gradients that develop in the loaf so that it rises more evenly. Okay, so one last thing, the lame or whatever, this is basically for scoring the loaf. Some people use sharp knives. My knives never seem to be sharp enough to do it right, and this always works. It's a double-edged razor blade with a holder. I tried making one by hand and I cut myself nicely. So I recommend getting a lame for scoring the loaf once the loaf is placed onto the baking stone. So we'll need this, and let's get a couple loaves and go into the kitchen. It's going to take about 25 minutes to bake all of this. We'll start with these two, and then I'll put the French loaf in last after these are baked. So let's head over to the kitchen. A little bit of cornmeal.
Come around too if you want. In this room.
bunch of scoring techniques that people use. I'm not great at it, but that's about it.
Can you describe that technique? You just looked like you just cut it.
Kind of. You know, you don't want to just sort of, you can deflate the loaves if you're too aggressive with the lum. And so you just want to kind of score that little crust that has formed so that the loaf can expand. And whenever you buy a French loaf at the store, you've seen evidence that it's been scored, and that's essentially what they're doing. So every few minutes we can spray the interior of the oven with the sprayer to get that sort of the steam effect. So on that baking stone, I wouldn't have had room for all 3 loaves. They would have been too close. So every few minutes, open the door. You don't want to open it too long so that you let all the heat out. But this is how you get slightly flaky crust. So, 25 minutes. That's the process where you develop the gluten. So there's some proteins that basically link together, and the kneading, you're kind of stretching them out, and you're developing the elasticity of the crumb. So if you don't really knead the dough, you don't really mix it up very well, you won't get a very chewy crumb. Okay, like maybe you've been familiar with like a professional French bread. Like it can be a little chewy, and you have to work on it a little bit. That's a well kneaded bread. I don't know what happens if you over knead a bread. I mean, usually it's not an issue. I guess if you put it in the mixer and then you get distracted and you watch a movie or something, I don't know what you'll wind up with. But
if you're doing it by hand, you'll run out of energy.
If you're doing it by hand, your hands will tire and your arms will tire probably before you over knead it.
And if you under knead it, this will be less chewy.
Yeah, you won't get as many. You won't. Yeah, the crumb won't be as chewy. I haven't done a whole lot of experimentation, and I didn't do that in the demo. Obviously, because of the timing of everything, I can't sort of do the whole demo of bread baking.
On the cooking shows they do that.
Yeah,
They do that.
If you have everything
one prepared,
you have one prepared, and you have every stage sort of ready to show people.
So how long would you need it for when you usually do it? If you put it in the mixer?
Yeah. So after the dough has sat and it's nicely hydrated, I'll mix it for an additional, like I'll run it in the mixer for like 3 or 4 minutes, and then I take it out and I sort of handle it, and that's where I get a feel. Okay, does it need more water or does it need more flour? If it's overly runny, I think this loaf was maybe slightly wet, because it did kind of sag a little bit, but not horribly so. But when you're handling it, that's when you get a feel for, if it's too dry or too wet. And I haven't really mastered this, so it's difficult to describe the texture of the dough. I guess just experience or working with maybe someone who's a professional baker or something is probably the best way. I should really go to like some sort of professional baking class just to sort out these last issues in my technique, like kneading and shaping the loaves, because my loaves aren't really shaped all that well. But let's keep adding some more water to the oven.
Ooh.